The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad will attend this week his first Arab League summit in 13 years. The Syrian foreign minister confirmed this in his first attendance at the preparatory foreign ministers meeting for the Arab summit in Jeddah. How did Syria's regional reintegration after more than a decade of a war on Syria occur? What changed the stance of Saudi Arabia and members of the GCC group of Persian Gulf countries? What about the U.S., who has condemned any normalization with Syria? Just a few of the angles that we'll cover in this edition of The Spotlight. First, let me introduce our guests. Hardy Schlanger, spokesman of the LaRouche organization, joins us from Potsdam, Germany. Also joining us is Ken Stone, executive committee member at Syria Support Movement, who joins us from Hamilton, Ontario. Welcome to you both. Hardy Schlanger, I'll start with you. Obviously, this is a big deal, and I'd like to find out from you how significant, though, is this attendance by the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in his first Arab League summit in 13 years, which was confirmed by the Syrian foreign minister in his first attendance at the Arab League preparatory foreign ministers meeting that was held in Jeddah.
Well, it's a huge deal because it represents a massive shift, a geopolitical shift underway in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, which until this point in time has been entirely dominated by British geopolitics and then American military. The Saudis had been an outpost of the British and then the U.S. oil companies. They were key to the whole petrodollar system. And the U.S. Was committed to regime change in Syria, still is, to getting rid of the Assad government, to the extent that, as Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, admitted, the U.S. was supporting the terrorists in Syria against President Assad. So the idea that the U.S. can continue to dictate policy to sovereign nations is now being overturned, and part of this is based on the Iran-Saudi rapprochement, the role of the Chinese in the region, but also the fact that the global South is now standing up to the U.S. and British bullies. And this is the major point of change, and hopefully this is just a first step toward cooperation that goes beyond just not fighting, but actually goes to the point of reconstruction.
All right, trying to figure out over here, Ken Stone, when did this all start? I mean, I go back to 18th of March of 2022, of last year, and that's when the news came out that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was visiting the UAE. This was his first trip to an Arab country since the year 2011. He met the rulers of Abu Dhabi and Dubai in this visit, and we saw them embracing each other. How did that happen? I mean, what led to the first outbreak that we see of this rapprochement, which happened, at least in the news, back on 18th of March of last year?
Well, I agree with the previous speaker that it's a sea change in the Middle East, but it's also a change in the balance of power of the entire world. I think that there's some factors that led to this sea change, some of which were alluded to by your other speaker. A couple of other factors to answer your question is that, first of all, the Syrian people and the Syrian government stayed firm. They resisted with the help of the government of Iran, of the government of Russia, Hezbollah, and certain loyal Palestinian militia groups. They stayed loyal. They stayed strong. They were able to defeat the U.S. proxy war on Syria to a great extent, even though the country is still occupied by the U.S., by Turkey, by Kurdish separatists, and by al-Qaeda elements in Idlib. So we're not out of the woods yet. But the changes, a great deal of thanks is due, and a great deal of kudos is due to the Syrian people, the Syrian Arab Army, the Ba'athist Party, and of course Bashar al-Assad, who stood firm. Look what happened instead to Libya, which was unable to resist and is now a failed state. So I think the principal thing is the popular resistance against the U.S. proxy war. Another issue is the fact that the U.S. was soundly defeated and left Afghanistan with its tail between its legs, which sent a signal to the countries of West Asia that the countries that were normally acting like Canada as vassals of the U.S. and the U.K., that the U.S. could no longer protect them. And then the big changes took place with the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, when the U.S. and NATO tried to isolate Russia, cut it off the SWIFT system, slapped sanctions on them. But Russia and China developed a new money-changing system. They avoided the sanctions. The sanctions ended up bouncing back on the West, the U.S., Canada, NATO, all these countries who provoked the war in Ukraine. And on top of all that, the People's Republic of China was able to organize a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which paved the way for these changes we see in Syria, and hopefully changes in Yemen as well.
Sure. Well, that rapprochement that Ken Stone mentions there, Harley Schneider, is obviously very important between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Back in 2022, when you had the UAE host the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, at that time there was also news that Jordan and Lebanon were also going through the reconciliation. With the Iran-Saudi Arabia reconciliation to have occurred, I don't want to say by default, but in a sense it is. You have the GCC countries of the Persian Gulf follow suit. So what are we looking at now? We're looking at a region that is kind of uniform in the way that they are all together in one unit, so to speak. Do you agree with that? I mean, there probably are some differences here and there, but for the most part, that's what we're looking at, isn't it?
Well, there are some differences, but those are insignificant compared to what's being done and the potential the region has as an economic power. You know, what was it that China could offer in terms of the Iran-Saudi rapprochement? It's not just being an honest broker. What China delivered, and this we have from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, they delivered a message that if you two countries work together, we will come in with you and rebuild Syria, rebuild Iraq, bring the Belt and Road Initiative to Southwest Asia. Now, this is the kind of development project that's been denied this part of the world because the way geopolitics works is you pit countries against each other, you pit tribes and families against each other, religious sects against each other, and you have no unified approach. Now, what happens if the Sunni and Shia people decide that a rapprochement, which would be followed by an economic development plan, is preferable to the kinds of wars and chaos and terrorism that's kept them apart all these years? And so I think the other point I just want to emphasize, your other guest made an important point. It's not just this region, it's global. The nations of the global south that were under colonial rule for much of the last 200 years now see in Russia's strength against the West and Ukraine, in China's economic development, they see that they no longer have to submit and give up their sovereignty to the demands of Western military and Western bankers. And so that's what the sea change is about. And it's clear that this has been in the works for a while, at least in the minds of some of the leaders. But it took the developments around, I think, particularly Saudi and Iran, to concretize the potential for this to occur.
When you take a look at the uniformity that exists now, Ken Stone, if you agree with that, and as a guest I mentioned, of course, there are some differences. But when you take a look at the uniformity that exists now, the region was used to the U.S. in particular chanting Iranophobia in terms of how Iran was a destructive player, and therefore the countries remained apart when it came to Iran. But the U.S. can't do that anymore. So then it leads to the question then, in a bigger sense, then what is the U.S. doing in the region if these countries are united? I mean, on top of that, they're the ones that have the resources, not the U.S.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. the purpose of the U.S. in the region is hegemonic. It wants to maintain its overarching control of the Middle East that it had from the end of the Second World War until very recently, and it wants to maintain its hegemony over the entire world. Since the end of the demise of the Soviet Union back in 1991, the U.S. was the sole superpower in a unipolar world. Now that's changed ever since Russia intervened to defend Syria and prevent it from being destroyed, not just regime change. Let's remember, the game, according to many analysts and much of the evidence, was not just to destroy, not just to knock over the government of Bashar al-Assad. It was to destroy Syria. It was to break it into little pieces, balkanize it, the better for the U.S. and Israel to gobble up the pieces. So that was the game. And now we're in a new game, and the U.S. will not be able to do that. The U.S. will probably not be able to continue its occupation. So the overarching thing here is that the U.S. has tried to maintain its hegemony in the Middle East. It's losing because it no longer has the military force, as was shown in Afghanistan. It no longer gives the political, economic, or social, moral leadership that it used to give in the world, because everyone can see that the power of the U.S. is disintegrating, that it's a declining empire, and that there are other choices now available. It's not the only game in town.
Sure.
There are other players involved, like China, Russia, and Iran. And the people in Southwest Asia would prefer to deal on equal terms with countries like that, rather than submit to being a vassal anymore of the U.S.
Well, this is what is confusing here, and maybe it's something that the U.S. doesn't get. Maybe, at least that's my reading into it, Harley Schlanger. Of course, you're an analyst, and tell us what you think when the U.S. and its lawmakers have actually proposed a bill that would warn and prohibit Washington from recognizing or normalizing relations with Syria. And on top of that, issuing a warning to other countries through this legislation, such as Turkey and some Arab countries, as it's stated, that if they engage with Assad, they could face severe consequences. What do you think? I mean, that's like, I'm not too sure how to qualify that, even in terms of a description of the way that the U.S. is trying to bully itself when it comes to this matter, when it comes to Syria.
Well, bullying is the right word, but it goes beyond that, because the intent of the people that are trying to destroy Syria, they're trying to destroy Russia. They're trying to break Russia apart as well. They're trying to break China apart. The problem is that the people running U.S. foreign policy are a very small group of people, but they control both parties in the Congress, they control the media, and they represent the corporate cartels, which are not just the military-industrial complex, defense sector, and so on, but the banks, which are collapsing in the U.S., the big pharma, the oil companies, the raw material companies. That's what the global hegemon is, to assume that all the wealth in the world should be at the behest of the United States and related countries, including Western Europe and, of course, the United Kingdom. Now, that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work because the people who are making these policies are not in the real world. They really believed that Ukraine can beat Russia in a war. They put everything, and now when I say they, I mean Obama, Hillary Clinton, put everything into the regime change drive against Syria, and they failed. So you have the Afghan failure, the Syria failure, and you have their so-called successes. People can look at what happened in Libya. Now, also, I would say that the people of Iran have also shown courage, joining with Syria and with Russia in fighting the terrorists in Syria, but also standing up against U.S. sanctions. The final point on this, the sanctions, as the other guest mentioned, haven't worked. In fact, they've backfired against the Western nations. So in the old words of Chairman Mao, the U.S. is on the verge of becoming a paper tiger. It doesn't have the force that it used to. And part of that, the way you stop a bully is you don't submit, you stand up. And just one example of that, when Blinken went to South Africa to lecture the foreign minister of South Africa about why don't they support sanctions against Russia, she said, Mr. Blinken, we are a sovereign nation. Don't come here and try to bully us. That's a new attitude. And I think it reflects this potential to not only end the so-called rules-based order, but establish the basis for the first time in human history for cooperation for mutual development of all nations, provided the U.S. can be stopped. And one final point here. The last card the U.S. has to play is the Israel card against Iran. And with Netanyahu as crazy as he is, don't be surprised if the Israelis try something to stir up even more in terms of the Iran situation. It won't work. In fact, the Israeli people, a significant portion of the Israeli people, are getting fed up with this. So we're on the verge of a major change if we can break the power of this unipolar order and the power of the military-industrial complex in the United States.
Sure. Well, the last thing that I have to say here is all these countries that are reconciling with Syria, Kent Stone, are very interested in investing in that country, especially when it comes to rebuilding it. But there's a couple problems here, maybe three of them. One, the U.S. occupation in Syria, which leads to instability in that country. Two, you have Israel that is bombing Syria repeatedly. And then you have the Caesar Act or Caesar sanction, which this new bill is going to build up on that, which prevents the interaction of Syria overall when it comes to, and other countries, from having trade relations. How can we overcome all this?
I think that the readmission of Syria into the Arab world will provide Syria with, first of all, a measure of national sovereignty, regaining some of that, and territorial integrity will come next. I think that the cooperation with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and its building of bridges between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, all are positive developments which will allow the Syrian people to go around the sanctions, to beat the sanctions that's been imposed upon them by the U.S. and its allies, such as Canada. And as for the military occupation of the eastern part, the eastern third of Syria, I do believe that is temporary, and that developments in Turkey, developments in Ukraine are going to foreshadow the end of that occupation.
Thank you so much for that. Kent Stone, Executive Committee Member at Syria Support Movement from Hamilton, Ontario. And thank you, Harley Schlanger, spokesman of the LaRouche Organization, Potsdam, Germany. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mika Watawe and the team, it's goodbye.